Good morning, I'm John Bailey. I'm very pleased to welcome you again this morning to your Maine State Museum. We're taking another road trip. We're heading down Route 201 to visit the museum today. In addition to the exhibit you see on the 4 floors, there's something special going on today. We're opening the Call Your Mother exhibit, Communication and Community in Bryant Pond, Maine. We're celebrating the switchboard, the last hand-crank telephone system in use in the United States. The phone booth is there. There are wonderful materials to kind of get people thinking about what it was like trying to use some of this equipment, trying to place a call, and the wonderful ways that you could connect in a community through the telephone switchboard. I'd like now very much to introduce Lori LaBar, the curator of this exhibit. She'll talk a little bit about this, walk you through it, and give you a much better idea of really some of the fun and exciting things that have to do with this display. So welcome.
LaBar, I'm the curator of the exhibit, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it for those of you who haven't read all of the labels yet, and then I will hand it over to some other people. On October 11th, 1983, the operators of the Bryant Pond Telephone Company made their last call. In fact, we have them here. The switchboard at the heart of this crank telephone system was located in the living room of Eldon and Barbara Hathaway. For 32 years, its neighborly operators formed the center of community life in this small western Maine village. Operator Eleanor Andrew summed up what it was like to be a telephone operator with the Bryant Pond Telephone Company. She said, quote, "We are many different people. We are telephone operators. We're babysitters. We find lost dogs, summon emergency vehicles, we take messages, we transfer calls, we have a wake-up service, we have a good night service. We can tell you how many teaspoons in a tablespoon. We can tell you how long to cook squash, and we can even tell you how to spell 12. The Bryant Pond Telephone Company achieved historic status in 1979 when it became the last magneto or hand-crank telephone system left in the United States. But Ms. Andrews' description of an operator's job in Bryant Pond hints at the company's real significance. As Barbara Hathaway put it, quote, "For 32 years, the switchboards in our living room were the pulse of the community." The operators, which included many members of the Hathaway family, were the heart that provided that pulse. Bryant Pond changed forever in 1983, when this last hand-crank system in the nation switched to dial-up service. The change was inevitable and paved the way for many of the services, such as internet access, that we all take for granted today, to be available in Bryant Pond. Otherwise, with the hand-crank system, hard to do internet. Because Bryant Pond's magneto system was such a late survivor, it was no longer the norm. And so the personal attention and the service to the community that it provided were not taken for granted. When the time came to update to dial service, the role of the phone company in community life was closely examined and was highly praised. The public debate over the change to dial-up provided unique insights into the patterns of social interactions in small communities throughout Maine and indeed throughout the U.S. during the earlier part of the 20th century, a time that everyone took for granted. Nobody ever talked about it because that was the standard, but by the time Bryant Pond closed and was sold and got updated, it was unique and people did talk about it. And so we're able to look back and see how things were elsewhere as well, using Bryant Pond as an example. The 1983 switchover profoundly changed the pace of life for the Hathaway family, out of whose living room the system had operated. It also rewove the threads of community in Bryant Pond. The lasting gift of the switchover is the view it provides us, decades later, of the way life in Maine used to be. The switchboards are a tangible reminder of that gift. We at the State Museum are absolutely delighted that Oxford Networks and Barbara Hathaway decided to make this the final home for the historic Bryant Pond switchboards. Many people were involved in building this exhibit. I would like to thank Diane Dunn of Oxford Networks and the late Barbara Hathaway and her children, Susan and Linda and Michael, for the opportunity to care for the switchboard. Susan and Linda and Mike's wife Penny, there she is, they provided most of the photographs that you see in the exhibit, and photographer Niles Lund donated his service and his photographs as well. Former Bryant Pond operator Andrea Hoyt acted as my technical editor. Is she here today?
No, she couldn't be.
Oh, that's too bad. I would have liked to have met her. I would send her my labels and make sure that they were right, because it's a system I'm not really familiar with, as you can imagine. I couldn't have completed the exhibit without the help of my many colleagues here at the museum, including John Bailey, Don Bassett, Sheila McDonald, Lindy and Judy from Conservation, and of course Scott Mosier and the guys from the shop. Thank you very, very much. And a special thanks to the Telephone Association of Maine for their generous support of this exhibit. Joel, the exhibit will be coming down the 28th. If you feel the need to move it again, we'll be glad to have your help. And thanks. And by the way, Erica Risberg is here from the Maine Folklife Center. So if any of you have memories of using a hand crank system or having a party line, anything like that, old memories of being on a telephone, you don't have to be from Bryant Pond. We'd love to have you talk with Erica. She'll be right in here. There's a sign-up sheet, but if she's not busy, just go right in. Thank you very much, and enjoy. This is the Bryant Pond telephone switchboard, and it was the last magneto, which is a hand crank telephone system that operated in the country, and it closed in 1983. And one of the things that makes this special too is not only was it the last one in the country, but it operated out of the Hathaways' living room. And they bought it in 1951. They put an addition on their house, so half the room had the switchboard and the other half had the television and a couple of easy chairs. And the family, the whole family was part of the telephone company. Michael worked on the lines. Eldon did all the repairs and worked on the lines. He also served as telephone operator. He and Barbara were the parents, and then Michael was one of the sons. And the only thing Eldon didn't do was he didn't do the night shift on the switchboard because he slept through the alarm. They had it rigged up to an alarm that would wake them up. But both their daughters served as telephone operators, and when the system switched over to dial-up service in 1983, Linda and Susan were the last telephone operators. They came back so that they could be the last operators. And that was a very, very fitting, since it was such a family business. What else can I tell you about this? And Eldon didn't really anticipate doing this. It was sort of a lark in a way. Eldon was looking for something else to do. They were facing layoffs at the railroad, and they just casually said to their neighbors who lived up the road, well, do you want to sell the phone business? And the neighbors said, sure. And before you knew it, they had a telephone business. And they started off with about 100 customers. And several of those customers, about 18 of those customers, were on what they called farmers' lines. And those are party lines that were operated by private individuals. And when they bought the company, all the farmers' lines decided they'd be party lines instead and go through the switchboard, because that way they didn't have to maintain the lines. So they started with about 118 customers, and 32 years later they had 529 customers. And at the beginning there were very few private lines, but by the end, about 80% of the people were on private lines. So it gradually became more and more work for less and less payoff in a way. And of course, all the telephones were antiques. And Eldon was kept very busy trying to get antique telephones and fix them up and make them so that they would continue to work for new customers. And the operators were always having to tell summer people how this system worked. And the kids would crank the phone, and they'd keep cranking it. You only have to crank it for a minute, you know. And the kids would they say, you can stop cranking now, you can stop cranking now. The operators were really more than just operators. They did everything from tell people how long to boil an egg to calling messages, you know, Bob, your mother's going to Norway, how much cranberry juice do you need? That type of a thing, and they really did. There was a lady who liked to take an afternoon nap, and she would call in and say, I'm going down for my nap now, and she wouldn't accept any calls. They'd hold all of her calls, and they'd take messages until she called and said, I'm awake, I'm taking calls again. And if it was a fire, you didn't need E911, you just called the operators, and they took care of it. And there's a little a little plaque behind me that has names on it, and that's the fire department. And all those names, there's a magnet that's across one of them, and that means that he's not available that day. So you'd call the switchboard and say, my furnace is on fire, and she'd call all those numbers, and that would take care of it. But one day, it was town meeting day. And everyone was at town meeting, and that was in the school gym where there was no phone, and someone called in a fire. So they had to think quick, how are they going to get a hold of the fire department? So they called a neighbor, and luckily the neighbor was not at town meeting, and the neighbor had to run over to the school and tell the fire department that there was a fire. And another time the same thing happened. There was a fundraiser for the fire department, and they were all at the school gym having a dance, and the poor neighbor had to go over again to the dance and get everybody and tell them there was a fire.
Somerset Telephone, when I started back in 1953, the operators were paid 25 cents an hour.
Wow.
And after we bought Phillips and Strong and some of the other areas, we raised them immediately to $1, and we were heroes for a long time.
I bet you were.
But the magneto system, of course, it took batteries.
Yep.
And the guy out on the end had to put fresh batteries in order to get telephone service. And so a lot of people stopped in the office and pick up batteries and take them home. The other thing about the magneto system was it was not uncommon to have 20 parties on a line. And also, between towns, these 20 people could be riding the toll circuit. So when a telephone toll call came in, the operator, in probably Skowhegan or Madison, would say, would everybody please get off the line? Which they did. And then the operator completed the call. And one of the other problem with magneto service, then 19 other people started picking up their phones to find out what was going on, and they couldn't hear anything. So interesting things that went on.
You should talk to, you should sign up to tell some of these things to Erica.
Okay.
Okay? Because she's recording all of this for the Maine Center for Folklife.
All right.
These three pictures depict what life was like in Bryant Pond around the time that the switchboard stopped operating. Althea Hathaway and Kenneth Berrimet were two of the operators, and this was set up in their living room of the Hathaway family. And you can see the curtains sort of give you a clue that this is not an office. This is really somebody's living room. But these pictures, which were taken by Dean Abramson, who did a bunch of the shoots for Time magazine, show just everyday life in Bryant Pond. There's the general store. There's everything that you'd expect to see in 1982, including the cash register and the cigarette in the cooler. But there's a crank telephone hanging above. And here, this is the bar of the Boiler Room restaurant. There's a bar just like you'd expect, a cash register, everything's very modern. But here's this early 20th century telephone in the middle of it. And that was completely normal in Bryant Pond. That's what I have. These are also a couple of photos from the Hathaway family, and this photo was taken by Dean Abramson, and you can see there are two operators working frantically, but in the background there's the television and a dog toy on the rug, and it really is the living room. And in quieter days, early on, there was only one switchboard. They didn't need two, and there's Barbara Hathaway braiding a rug, and she was able to actually have some time to do her own things, do some knitting when she was acting as operator. And here she is a couple of maybe 15 or 20 years later with the dog while the girls are working in the background. This really was a family operation. Here's the operator, who's Bob McKean, who wasn't family technically, but he became a member of the family. And this is Bryant Hathaway was a grandson, and there he is playing at the switchboard. And Beauty must have referred to her personality. She was a very sweet dog. And there she is, somebody has her posed at the switchboard. And the family Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, especially early on, before things got too hectic, they were held right near the switchboard, so that whoever was on duty wouldn't miss Thanksgiving dinner. So there's Eldon sitting down, and he's forwarding calls. People tend to call family on the holiday. And it was their living room. There's everyone watching the TV while Barbara's working the switchboard. But that looks like here's Barbara working and all the guys are having fun. But a lot of times it was Eldon manning the switchboard as well. And they also had 24-hour service. For a long time, the telephone system in Bryant Pond had been in a general store, and the phone was only available for use during work hours. So unless you were trying to reach somebody on your own party line, you couldn't get a phone call after the store was closed. So when it became in their living room, they were able to keep it open 24 hours a day. And there's Barbara, who looks like she's had a long night. Maybe she's coming off a night shift, or maybe she's starting very early in the morning with her cup of coffee and her newspaper, and she's getting ready for that shift. And they had an alarm. Whoever was on duty at night would sleep on the couch. If Barbara was on duty, her bedroom was right next, the room next to the switchboard, so she could hear the alarm at night. There were 4 or 5 payphones in the village of Bryant Pond, and because people from away really didn't know how to use the magneto system, they had to have instructions inside each telephone. This one happened to be in the Stoll Company mill, which was a turning mill. They made silk spools for silk thread, and then of course they made other things as well. But this one was inside, which is why it's in such good shape. But it still has the instructions, because if someone from away comes by, they can't figure out how to use the phone. And the operators could always tell if you'd put in enough money, because a quarter, a dime, or a nickel all made different noises when they landed in the till. So in the phone booth that was outside the general store, if someone tried to put in less money than they were supposed to put in, let's say they put in a nickel instead of a quarter, the operators would call the general store, and someone from the general store would come out and tap them on the shoulder and say, "Excuse me, sir, you need to put in another dime," or a nickel or a quarter, or whatever it was. The operators at Bryant Pond did so many things. They had call forwarding, call waiting. They were very, very helpful. They helped kids with their homework. But one thing they couldn't do was speak French. So if somebody came from Quebec, or if a French speaker from southern Maine or one of the Maine towns came and tried to use the payphone, they would call a local resident, and she would act as an interpreter for them so that they could complete the phone call. Yeah, I think I do. Oxford County Telephone and Telegraph bought the Bryant Pond Company in 1981, and they intended to switch it over to dial-up service. And almost immediately there was a lot of townsfolk were very upset, because they really liked the quality of the service they'd been getting, the personal service that they felt that dial-up service didn't offer, and the sense of community that this magneto system really offered the town of Bryant Pond. So almost immediately there was an organization formed called Don't Yank the Crank, and they sold T-shirts to raise money, and it started being picked up by local press and gradually national press. We have an article that was printed in Time magazine, that was also in People magazine. It was in newspapers all over. There were over 30 different television crews that came in to talk to the Hathaway family, and it was a national story, and very important. So important that it took 2 years for the Public Service Commission and the 2 phone companies to settle on whether or not they would in fact make the change. The lineman's phone was Eldon's telephone that he used when he was repairing people's phone lines. There's a couple of copper clips, and they would clip to the wire, so that once he completed and fixed somebody's wire, he could call and make sure that the phone worked. And like many things that the phone company used in the early days, it was Army surplus. First, all of their wire was Army surplus as well.
Most of the telephones that the company owned were actually antiques. This is one of the newer phones that people had. As you can see, it's sort of a mid-20th century desk-style phone, and similar to other dial-up phones, except that the magneto system has taken over the center spot where the dial would be. But most people's phones were the kind that were used in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and Eldon had to continually repair them so that the people would have enough telephones. He was always getting old telephones from magneto companies as they closed. He would buy their telephones and then he'd repair them so that people in his town could use them. On the dial town. So much fun. I'm just getting a dial tone. I'm not getting an operator. Oh, and it's busy.
Oh, try again.
I think it went through this time. No.
We can.
Call 813-777-6591, please. Thank you. Is this your son? Your daughter? Youngest operator I've ever had. Let's see. One of the nice things about having this exhibit up at this time of year is that thousands, literally thousands of school children are seeing it. The plan was to install this on Tuesday, and we always start a few days early because there's always something that goes wrong. And in this case, it was that the ramp, that we could get the switchboards into the truck, but there was a ½ inch of clearance, and then we had to back down a ramp to our loading dock, so then the ramp was at an angle which was about 3/4 of an inch. So anyway, we had to wait until Wednesday to install it, and there were hundreds and hundreds of kids in that day. So since Wednesday, there's over 1,000 school kids have seen this, and we talked to more people. I had no idea how many people in this state has been telephone operators. It's amazing. We had, in the first hour, we had, I think, 2 telephone operators, the daughter of a telephone operator, and somebody who repaired lines for a switchboard when he was in the service in Germany. And that was in the first hour. And it's been really fun to see everyone's reaction to the exhibit. People just, they don't walk by it. It's something that they talk about, and the kids are just, it's like you took something off of Mars and plunked it in this museum. And I mean, and those dial phones out there, if you guys haven't tried this, by the way, there's a bank of phones. They date from the 20s to the 70s, and most of them are dial phones. So especially if you're here with kids, turn them on to dial phones. There's a reason we call it, oh, what number did you dial? Because these days you don't dial, you just kind of punch, punch, punch. But anyway, those dial phones will work. Just dial 0, and the operator, who may or may not be under the age of 12, will ask you how to direct your call, and you can call your mother. That's the title of this exhibit, and you can call your mother or your son or your daughter or your best friend. And it doesn't matter where they are because it's all going through the internet. So we've got the old technology going through the new technology, and it's free. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you guys very much.